so in 2015, when the Zipkin community came together, we named it Open Zipkin because it was like not run by Twitter anymore. And our first gathering was actually in about July of 2015, and we went to like a site who incidentally had stopped using Zipkin, and we wanted to basically go around the table, figure out what all the problems were, aggregate community, and center it on that. So like the first like time that in the tracing that I was aware of people using the open thing was sort of like Open Zipkin, but it's no longer like we're not in the like list of opens anymore. Anyway, so we had some working groups, and at some point in time, there were towards the end, I think it was the end of 2015, there was a project discussed that like everybody decided was a real problem, which is like context propagation wasn't well solved, and it certainly wasn't solved uniformly. And what do I mean by that? I mean like so trace data that gets into the thing to analyze is sort of like what you would have these like push-pull discussions and scraping or not. That's the collected details, like the latency information, blah, blah, blah. The contextual parameters that allow all of this data to be related together in a tree, in that's sent by headers and stuff. And so that's the context propagation. And so basically when things break, it's usually in this area, I mean, and also clocks. So there was a project called like distributed trace context propagation or something like that. And then, so we had started that in like July, and then another meeting or two, and it was like, okay, like some folks were interested in that. One vendor called Lightstep, I think they weren't even called that at the time. They had been in stealth or something. And then Yuri, aka Uber. And so we went on holidays. Came back, and all of a sudden there's this thing, open tracing. It's like, whoa, what happened? So anyway, you look and it's like rename. so it was renamed, and so in early 2016, this project has been like rescoped as sort of like a instrumentation library interface with an initial target to be 1.0 by I think February that same year. So it's quite ambitious. I didn't have them. And so at the beginning, actually the Zipkin community were designing most of the things. So Yuri at Uber was still actually running Zipkin, I think. And the other folks like our Cassandra lead, they had designed the first version of the Java interfaces, and different people were designing things. So I think maybe Lightstep were focused on the Go side, and then Yuri was doing the Python. So it's just like general collaboration. The scope started to change, and it started to sort of like scare off the Zipkin community, because it was like, okay, this is also logging, by the way. And so we're like, no way, we do not want people to start funneling their logs into the tracing system. And so over time, Zipkin distanced it from that because it would have just overloaded and put that in the wrong spot. And so that project continued. Even now, people are starting to talk about it, even though it's sunset. There was like kind of like a break where things were working. Like Uber formalized that they were going to work on a fork, called Jaeger, and blah 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 happened. And so effectively it became like, okay, you have community instrumentation, or you have things that are branded as open tracing, which usually work with Jaeger. And but some of them would work with other systems too, not usually, but like, for example, the Zipkin tracer for Java and open tracing is actually the most popular open tracing trace that there is. So these things are like about the library you would collect data with, but it has zero opinion on anything about like the headers used or the data format. I was much more excited in like the stuff happening. So Google started a project called Google Instrumentation Java, which is like an awesome engineer's name. So I was working with that group because I thought that the engineering was far better. I like the idea that you'd know what sort of stuff would be, you know, how the sausage is made, if you will. And that's like alongside a large ecosystem in Zipkin. So we basically didn't pick favorites. So like Yelp would do the Python thing, and we had first party repositories for different things. But like this project, I guess some manager or something decided that Google Instrumentation Java is not a good name. And so that was renamed to like Census or Open Census rather, which would be similar to like how Twitter's Zipkin became Open Zipkin, because it was formerly like the idea was that this was technology and ideas, and maybe not exactly the same code, but like the same principles of development. And so Open Census became like, you know, an alternative full scope, and it would reduce the amount of problems you'd have. Like, so for example, one of the problems with open tracing is you had no idea the performance attributes of the actual implementation, because everything was up for grabs. Like it could write data into the trash can, it could do anything, and so you had no idea the format of the data or anything. Whereas Census was more opinionated, and so it used like protoblock data definitions for like how the data would be shaped as it sends out, really simplify the exporter model. So for example, as people normally when they're doing metrics collection would know like here's the various shapes, and so that's how you can see like some metrics tools, like in Java there's something called Micrometer, which has like a billion backends. It's because they really did a good job of saying like here's the only responsibility you need to do. You need to like export the data, and so it's very easy. And so I really like that approach. So that project was going on. I was kind of like funny, like why is nobody at Google talking about this project? And it's like all these things are being marketed, and like, don't you feel like this is gonna not help you? And then all of a sudden I see this person, Jaana, like daring to write content on her blog about like census and stuff, and I'm like, wow, somebody's actually daring to speak up, and like we exist. So I was quite excited. I was a big fan, and still I'm a fan of Census. It's actually a well-used library. It's still going actually. So for example, Netflix is a Zipkin site as we classify things, but like as real life is that like in different categories you're going to have different like leaders, right? So for example, the Open Census node library is you know, frankly, it's better than the Zipkin.js at the moment. I'll be honest about that. And so for their site, they use the Java Brave library. It's got the longer history, it's stable, all that stuff. And then in their own site, they also use Open Census for the node, and yet they still use the same Zipkin format, because now that you're using like Census or this, or even Jaeger can spit out the same format. And so that was like the most important thing for them, was to be able to process the data. Like sometimes people forget about it, but it's like at some point you need to actually process this information. So basically at some point, I guess there's like this like, you know, CNCF, which is like a foundation for logos. And inside of there's software also. So at that point, I think Jaeger and Open Tracing were like formalized projects. Open Census was not. Okay, so what happens next? And so I think there is an idea that like, okay, this landscape is a little bit too complicated, and we have Census. And by the way, Census also does metrics. So the funny thing is that people, when they talk about tracing, sometimes they talk about like tracing first. Like they try to collect everything as like request traces, and then derive metrics out of that, like latency, histograms, blah, blah, blah. But there's other things going on in the process too, right? So like things are coming up and down. There's other types of metrics that are not request based, blah, blah, blah. So like that was another reason why I like Census. I was like, okay, well, somebody's paid attention about these relationships. Maybe the dimensions can match up. Awesome. So anyway, that same basic design principles were what was, I believe, because I'm not actually a part, I don't identify open telemetry, but basically it's basically the scope is very similar, much more similar to Open Census than it is about Open Tracing. Like, yes, there's an API, and Census I think was more like technically like classes and things, but but at the end of the day, I think everybody's going to use the same implementation, at least now, while things are like finding their way. The other thing that changed at least for Java users, and I'm not sure about the other programming languages, but formerly like open tracing and open census were very much like you configure everything, whereas in open telemetry, at least the Java side seems to be like fully like agent, like how Skywalking agent would just like turn on the tracing button, and so more biased towards the automatic tracing. So in fact, in the Java, I think 100% of the instrumentation are actually in the agent bucket, and I don't see any instrumentation outside of that bucket. And the only other thing that's relevant, and I know this is a fire hose, right? But we have, I think, Open Census, similar to how Zipkin has a bridge into the Open Tracing API. Open Telemetry has a bridge for the Open Tracing API, similar to how like you can run the Java Zipkin library and then choose to use Open Tracing API on top of that by a bridge. That same type of bridge model exists. So if people are on the Open Telemetry side, so if people are using that stuff, they could use that existing code to the degree they have it.